there are two. One is that intimacy is somehow weakness. If I don't live with this protective shield, somebody is going to get close enough to me and identify that as a weakness and take advantage of me. And so I'm going to protect it. I'm going to look strong and hide those places.
Welcome to the Crucible Project Podcast. The Crucible Project is a nonprofit organization committed to creating a world of men and women who live with integrity, grace, and courage, helping them to fulfill their God-given purpose. This podcast will discuss important and sometimes difficult topics while delivering practical life applications with men and women who are currently practicing this work. We are igniting Christ-like change in men and women through experiences of radical honesty and grace.
Lawrence, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, good to be here, Tim. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on board to talk about this topic of intimacy. And I guess, in terms of experiencing intimacy, I really want to start at the beginning of that, and that is what is true intimacy? What is intimacy? How would you define it, and why is it important?
I guess if we just start with a dictionary, it talks about being close, being familiar, being attached, and all those kinds of things. I think most of the definitions, though, in the dictionary kind of fall short. I heard one that made more sense to me, and that was to announce oneself from the innermost part, an expression of a way of revealing the innermost parts of who I am to another person, and they as well to me. Because we can have conversations with people all the time, but it doesn't mean we're experiencing intimacy in any way. I'm not sure. Years ago there was a guy that coined the phrase. I wish I could remember who it was to give him credit. But he said intimacy means into me see, allowing another person to see inside of us and us see inside of them without anything hidden, any pretense, just to see me as I am.
Wow, that is deep, and that feels scary. Obviously,
yeah.
You know what I mean? This whole thing of announcing where I'm really at. So you would say probably that if I go to the grocery store and someone asks me a cashier asks me, how am I? It's probably not a good time to become.
Yeah, probably, right? Probably not, because most of the time they're not. My experience is most of the people that ask how you doing don't wait around for an answer. They're asking the question. It's really a way of just saying hi, right. But instead we say hi, how are you? When we really don't mean how are you. We mean I'm acknowledging that you're there, but I really want to keep moving. Intimacy is something different. It's something more. You can be in the same room or house with someone and not be intimate with them. You asked me earlier about why it's important, because we're made for it. We're made for intimacy. We were created in the image of God, who just his very nature is a reflection of intimacy, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit existing in one. We're made for that. Otherwise, we live with this sort of a hole in our souls, and it opens up this space in us for distrust and fear and anger in almost every area of our lives.
That's really amazing. So it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a duality, right? Like two people have to be involved in desiring to face each other, right? Face to face. If you go back to the Trinity mentioned in Genesis about Adam and Eve not being intimate with God, right? They were hiding. Would you say that's the opposite, is hiding?
Yeah, it is. In fact, it is the opposite of intimacy. This idea of hiding. When I hide a part of who I am, I really can't ever experience the love that I'm created for. I can't experience intimacy or love, not with God, not even with myself or other people, when I'm hiding, I used to have these, I don't know, not crazy thoughts, but it finally dawned on me once that the love that I was missing that feeling of love and intimacy was because I was applying this reverse logic that if I hide those parts of me that I have trouble loving, that somehow you'll love me because you don't see the real me. But deep down, what I really knew is that you can't really love me, and I can't be confident in your love for me because I know you don't know me. I know that I'm really hiding a part of me that is really who I am. And knowing that I'm hiding it, I know you're loving a false me. You're loving an image that I'm projecting, not really me.
But don't a lot of people operate that way? They project this false self or persona for a long time, right? I mean,
well, yeah, I mean, and I was a pro at it, and I think I'm still pretty good at it, because you have to, at least I thought, you've got to project this image, as a pastor, you got to project this image from the pulpit. People get to see what you project from the pulpit. Very few people get to see the real Lawrence. That's a terrible way. It's a terrible way to live.
That sounds like a heavy load to carry on a daily basis. So it's not just with two people. It sounds like you can have intimacy with yourself too. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, I really think Tim, that's the whole basis of it. When Jesus talks, he's quoting the law in the Old Testament. He's quoting God's command to the original first command to Israel. He's quoting it in Mark 12, 29 and 30. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might and all your strength. And then he says, and the second one is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so right in there, he's telling us that there are three relationships that we have to experience intimacy in to be whole: our relationship with God, our relationship with ourselves, and our relationship with other people.
So where do we start? Do we start with God? Do we start with other people? Do I start with myself?
I think you have to start with all three of them, or at least the first two. I think you have to start with God and you have to start with yourself, because I can try to love God, but I struggle to really love God fully and be completely honest with God when I haven't really learned to love myself. There are these parts of me that I hide even from God, as though I could hide something from God. But those are areas I hide from God. I don't pray about them. I don't talk to God about them. I don't open up to him about them. I pray, I would pray around those areas when in reality, what God wanted to talk with me about and sit with me about was the areas of deepest areas of need in my life that I wouldn't talk about.
So, and do you feel too, Lawrence, that in some ways, right, the way I love myself or don't love myself at times kind of reflects my perception of God, and maybe that I'm not lovable enough to in that relationship with neighbor and myself too. Like, I see people loving their neighbors pretty poorly. Would it be safe to say that they're loving themselves pretty poorly too?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm going to treat my neighbor, I'm going to treat the person closest to me with almost the same disdain that I have for myself. I'm going to look at you, Tim, and I'm going to not be able to love you fully because I see in you something of me that I can't love.
The challenge to love myself, the challenge to be intimate with myself really helps with other relationships. And man, that seems like such a huge burden though, like, let me ask you this. What are some common myths? You've kind of touched on some things, common myths about intimacy that we kind of get confused about?
There are two. One is that intimacy is somehow weakness. If I don't live with this protective shield, somebody is going to get close enough to me and identify that as a weakness and take advantage of me. And so I'm going to protect it. I'm going to look strong and hide those places. One of the things we get missed is that intimacy is weakness. And the other is, I think at its root, intimacy is unsafe. If I show you who I really am, if I really expose to you what I really feel, you won't love me. And what I want most, because I'm created that way, is to be loved. If I show you who I really am, you won't love me. And the reason I believe that is because I've convinced myself that that part of me is not lovable.
Yeah, totally unlovable.
Yeah.
Well, we did a podcast earlier with John Casey, who was talking about radical honesty and grace. Yeah. And he was saying some of the same stuff, right? Like if I don't believe that I'm lovable, I'm not going to disclose those things about me. I'm going to hide them. And so on the other side, right, he was talking about how we need to pick people and situations that we feel that we can safely share being honest with.
And I think a place to start is learning to be honest with God. One of the biggest things for me in recent years has been learning to be with God and just be with him and not feel the need to, have all of religious stuff to say, but just be with him and really express where I am emotionally, where I am spiritually with him, and learning to do that alone with God begins to free me up to do that with the most intimate people in my life. I mean, I think John is right. You got to be careful. You got to be careful who you just start sharing your innermost thoughts with. So.
Yeah, but God is a great place to start. And I even look in scripture, and there's plenty of instances where men and women express their anger with God. They express their points of view. They disagreed with God, and God seemed to be able to take that and hold that pretty well. So,
yeah, I mean, David is King David is a prime example. In the urban community, we check in around selahs and not sachet, but it's basically the same. But we basically are taking that right from David, where he is expressing in its raw form what he's feeling. And in some of the Psalms, he goes back and forth between emotions, experience them all at the same time. And God says of this guy, he's a man after his own heart.
So God can take it. God can take all my stuff.
He can take it, yeah.
And that's good news. That's really good news, because I got a lot of stuff to give.
Oh, yeah.
So another myth, too, that comes out, a lot of people equate sexual intimacy as kind of the main form of intimacy, that really intimacy doesn't occur unless I'm engaging in sexual activity. Can you speak a little bit about that and kind of the myth of that, too?
Yeah, I think maybe that's what scares men most about it, that we equate it so closely with sexual intimacy. And so when you start talk about being intimate with another man, red flags go up all over the place, emotionally for us. But I do think, though, that one of the reasons that we tend to equate sexual intimacy with intimacy as the main form of intimacy, I think because in its purest form, sexual intimacy between a husband and a wife is perhaps one of the highest forms of intimate expression. I think to dismiss it as not that is to cheapen it and miss what God intended. So I think part of the reason we get off about it is because it really is a high form of expression between a man and a woman. In fact, it is so much so that it is almost a worship experience, so much so that God equates the relationship between a man and a woman with the relationship between Christ and his bride, the church. Because sexual intimacy, like true worship, I don't mean the singing of 2 hymns and a prayer, but really engaging with God, the two involve every aspect of a human being in the expression of love. Our minds, our wills, our emotions, our bodies joining together and becoming one. What makes a man feel so complete and so strong is also the thing where he is most vulnerable. On one level, we're afraid of being that vulnerable, but in the sexual relationship, we experience that vulnerability on a level that we really need. Because when the intimacy is absent outside of the sexual relationship, we try to get that intimacy without the risk of intimacy, if that makes sense.
Just acting out physically.
Just acting out physically. And we do get some form of connection in it, but because it's not happening other places, because there is not a looking in the eye, because there is not an exchange between the other person other than the physical, what happens is that we keep going to sex to find that, and we can't find it there because it starts outside of the bedroom.
Right. The other forms of intimacy that aren't the physical part.
Those aren't there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that can be started outside of the bedroom. That's really valuable too, because I think it breaks away a lot of the misconceptions about what men really have. I don't know if they've been taught it, but just kind of thought that that's what intimacy really was.
Yeah, and our wives are looking for just the opposite.
Yeah.
They're looking for a connection outside of that. And when they don't get that, they don't feel connected sexually.
So that begs this question too, then, I think, what are ways to express intimacy with other men? Can I learn those other forms of intimacy? Can men help me learn that kind of pre-bedroom stuff, in a sense?
I think that a good place to start with men is the check-in. I didn't experience anything like that until the Crucible. Peter Scazzero has something like it in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality and Emotionally Healthy Relationships. He calls community temperature check, very much like a check-in, where you're sitting across from another person, but it's an exchange of questions and answers. But it's very much like a check-in. But the ability of another man not only to hear you, but for you to hear them and hold space is powerful. You're going to share your innermost feelings about something, and this person is going to hold space for you and listen to you and receive that without judgment and fully accept you is a really good place to start. Whether it's a community temperature check or a check-in or whatever you want to call it, to sit across from a person and share. Years ago, when my wife and I, not that we're perfect now, but years ago when we were having significant problems, I discovered that my face couldn't lie. My mouth could, but my face couldn't lie.
And your wife would see your face.
She would see my face and hear my words, and they wouldn't be the same. I wanted to express the words. I wanted her to be able to fully express herself without reading or even seeing judgment in my eye. And so what we learned to do, because we both love tea, still do, is that each evening we would turn off all the lights and have one candle and 2 cups of tea and sit across from each other and just talk. Men have to create space intentionally where they are open and honest with at least one person in their lives. And I think you start small and you learn to share. It could just be how your day went. It's a place to start.
Scazzero and Crucible and all kinds of places teach that check-in. We use Sachet and you guys use Sela. It's just basically getting in touch with my emotions, right? And providing a context for those emotions, about why I'm feeling that way or what is it that's stirring up those emotions. And then the other person holding space, right, is listening and just letting a person tell their feelings and their context and just listening to that.
Yeah, because it's good for you to know that. So if you and I are starting a conversation, Tim, and I check in that I'm sad or I'm angry, and I give you some context around that, you get a look into who I am in that moment so that you can love me where I am. Otherwise, if you don't know that that's what I'm carrying with me to the conversation, you may read into some of my responses that this is about you, that my response is about you. And now all of a sudden you've got a wall, I've got a wall, and what I'm feeling really is not about Tim at all. It's about something that happened earlier in my day that I'm still carrying. But your capacity to hear that whole space for me frees you and I up to draw closer in our conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then it's into you I see, right?
Yeah.
That's basically what you're opening the door of. So you talk about Pete Scazzero and his insight on healthy relationships. What else have you learned from his writing, because I know it's made an impact on you?
You cannot be, I want to say it right the way he says it, you cannot be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature.
Wow, say that again.
That you cannot be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. And that's been huge. It's been huge for me, huge for my wife, our church, that understanding where I am emotionally and that connection with where I am spiritually, that those two are inseparable. That was me. I was preaching, I was ministering, I was doing all of this stuff, this spiritual stuff. But I was a mess emotionally. When I came to the Crucible and my initial weekend in March 2012, I think, I was a mess. I just wanted to really go somewhere. I just wanted to die. I was an emotional mess because I had been indirectly, unintentionally taught all my life that God didn't care how you felt, only what you did. Only how you served him. He didn't, only that you were faithful, not how you felt. And so I just learned this stuff that for years. But anyway, you asked me about Pete Scazzero, and that's been the main thing, is understanding the need to be emotionally mature, emotionally healthy, and not trying to separate that from spiritual health. He does a great job in presenting a blended, balanced approach to emotional health and spirituality, because you got some churches that only focus on spiritual, and then you have others who do soul work, who only focus on emotional or soul. Sure. He does a really good job with the blend of the two. Basically, ignoring either one results in kind of an imbalance.
Well, and speaking of the church and our spiritual emotional health, how did Jesus show intimacy as a model for us to follow?
Jesus was the perfect model of it. Not just in the doctrinal sense, because he's 100% man, 100% God. Not sure. just that, but because he was emotionally healthy, that he was always fully aware of God the Father. He was always fully aware of himself and fully aware of people around him, and he shows it. He demonstrates it. There's a scene in Mark 5. This woman has been hemorrhaging for 12 years. Remember, and so by law she's isolated. She's unclean. Hiding. She's unclean. And then she presses her way through the crowd, and she touches Jesus. If I touch the hem of his garment, whatever she says. But Jesus notices when she touches him, not just physically. He noticed that there is an exchange that happens between the two of them. He turns and he looks for her, and he searches the crowd, not so he could find her, but so she could find him. So he could they could look each other in the eye, and she could know that she was loved as she was. And then there's this part where Jesus puts people like me to shame. She identifies herself as the one who touched him. And then the text says something like, and she told him the whole truth. And I think all of it, 12 years of it. And what's more remarkable is that Jesus listened. He listened to her. He held that space for her. He let her tell a story that she needed to tell, that maybe she didn't get to tell to anybody for 12 years. Jesus was able, in a way, to look at people and know that they were seen, to know they were heard. Sometimes that's all we really want, is just God can just somebody see me, somebody hear me. And Jesus is just a master at it.
Well, and unfortunately, too, that just reminds me of sometimes in our churches, we don't do a great job. We put up these rules for engagement, right? Or, okay, those people need to go over here. We'll have a place for them, but Jesus invites those people into the main, because we are all those people. Jesus invites us all to intimacy and invites the church to intimacy, which I think, like we were talking before, that's scary. What's the hardest part in experiencing intimacy, or some of the hardest challenges? Because if it was so easy, don't you think people would do it all the time?
I don't know that there is another. I really think
it's just fear.
At the root of all of it is fear. There's a passage, I think, in First John, that says there's no fear in love. But perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment, and he that feareth is not made perfect in love. Then it says something like, we love God because he loved us first. I think at the root it is fear. I got a buddy and I used to call this the Noah factor. It just has to do with the struggle to find somebody in our lives who can stand to see us naked and still love us. And that's the hardest part. Protecting image, wondering if the people who follow me, if the people who come to church and listen to me preach will still come if they knew I was a broken man, if they knew I was imperfect. That's really the hardest part. I think at the root, really, it's fear.
You were talking before about your story with the Crucible. How else has the Crucible Project helped you in your understanding and practice of intimacy?
The biggest part is getting used to using I statements and owning what I'm feeling, owning my own junk, recognizing that it's there and that it might still be there tomorrow, but because I know it's there. It's the first time I'd heard this term was on a Crucible Weekend, was to get it out in front of you so it's not driving you from behind, and so I still have some brokenness. I still, sometimes do stupid stuff. Just ask my wife. Sometimes I'll say something really stupid. But I think the biggest thing is that I now know how to get it out in front of me so that I know it's there and I can choose to make another decision and not be a victim of what's there.
Wow.
And just being able to find guys that can see me naked. Emotionally.
Yeah. I hope the audience figured that out. I'm having faith that they're good enough to. Although we have talked about sex and all this other stuff, so I don't know. Lawrence, if you were to give men advice who want to get better at intimacy, and obviously our audience is everybody out there, so it's people that have experienced Crucible, people that haven't experienced Crucible. What would be some advice to give them if I'm looking to get better at intimacy? There's been a lot of great nuggets you've already given us, but
I say start with a check-in. Find somebody, teach it to somebody if you have to, and teach them how to create the safe space. Don't wait to find somebody. Go create you somebody if you don't have somebody. To go home and teach it to your wives or to your spouses and let them know that, this is, what I need to be whole or whatever. And I'd like you to participate in this with me and start to practice checking in and being honest. Now, I will put a disclaimer on. Don't try to use check-in or honesty to manipulate to get sex. Don't pretend to be honest and open so that your wives can feel like you're open and honest. That's not the goal. The intimacy is for us. It's for the other person as well, but it's for us. But and don't unload your guilt on another person. Sometimes guys get free. We get liberated, and all of a sudden I'm no longer carrying this secret of shame, and now I'm going to run home and I'm going to unload this on my wife because I can't carry it anymore. That's unfair that you've carried something and now you're going to dump it on your spouse who hasn't had the benefit of what you've been taught. So find somebody you can teach it to. Tim, I had to get a couple of pastor friends and teach them this so that I could have some space, because I got tired of being in groups of pastors where we couldn't be honest with each other. So I have two pastors, really good friends, that we get together once a month and stare each other in the face. And one of us gets on the hot seat and the others, we get to unload and be fully honest with each other. But I had to go out and find some guys willing to take that risk so that I could have that space. I mean, initially it was selfish because I wanted it, but I found that they wanted it too. So I say just start a small men's group. Start with your wives.
Yeah. Well, that may feel selfish, but I think it feels more like love. You're loving yourself by doing that, loving your brothers by doing that. And then I think you're loving God by doing that too. So,
yeah.
And I think that creates some amazing community. Any other resources that have helped you on the journey with this that you just want to close with?
Wow. Yeah, I can think of one really ancient author whose writings I've really enjoyed. Henry Nouwen, particularly the writings on The Wounded Healer, have been great. But two contemporary authors, especially around the idea of intimacy in relationships, that have been huge for me. One is a lady by the name of Ruth Haley Barton.
Oh, yeah.
Man, just some incredible stuff. She's made me love paper books again. Wow. I had everything on my iPad, but now I've got shelves of paper books again. Ruth Haley Barton and a guy by the name, he's been around a while, called Gary Smalley. And only one book I've ever read of his called The DNA of Relationships. Yeah, those two I'd recommend. Gary Smalley talks about this dance that we do in relationship around each other. But yeah, those two have been huge for me in recent years.
Wow. Well, thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure. I'm sure we'll be talking more about other topics down the road. Of course,
you want to talk to me again? So.
Yeah, why not? Why not?
Okay.
So, but thanks, Lawrence, for spending time with us, and many blessings on you, and thank you for unpacking intimacy for us.
Hey, thanks, Tim. I'm glad to be here.
For more information about our weekends, please go to thecrucibleproject.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Rate and review wherever you are listening, and subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Also, don't forget to check out myjourney2.com for your free 2-week trial. That's myjourneyto.com. Thank you for listening.